Listen, you guys don't know everything there is to know about me. I mean, sure, you know I know a lot about Naruto. Sure, you know I have a lovely girlfriend by the name of Dorothy. Sure, you know this is my merch and you can buy it in the link down below. It's on Fourth Wall. But do you know that I'm also an avid ReZero fan? You probably didn't, because I never talk about it. But for those of you who've been watching closely at home, you'll know that I have Rem and Ram statues right here. And this has been my subtle nod to all the other ReZero fans out there that I'm just like you. But then Nick, if you're such a big fan of ReZero, why haven't you talked about it on this page? And genuinely, it's a really good question. And the only answer I can really provide is because nobody else is. But it's come to my attention recently that ReZero is actually like insanely popular, which makes the idea that nobody talks about it on YouTube all the more perplexing. And thus, as I was watching back through season 2 today, an idea came to me. A simple and straightforward idea that I can't believe I haven't thought of until this point. Talk about ReZero. And considering how incredibly dense and full the ReZero universe is between the manga's 6 arcs, the light novels, and the anime, there is an insane amount to talk about with ReZero. So where do I start? Well, today I want to talk about the thing that I find the most interesting in the ReZero universe. The witches. See, while many people think of ReZero as a story about the Japanese kid who gets isekai'd into another universe and can reset his life by dying, fundamentally, when you boil it down, ReZero is a story about witches. Without the power of the Witch of Envy, Subaru wouldn't have the reset by death ability. Amelia's life is highly warped by the fact that she looks like Satella, the Witch of Envy. The witch cultists serve as the main antagonists of the story for wide swaths of it, and therefore through all of ReZero is sewed a line that always comes back to witches. But what is a witch in the ReZero universe? Are the only witches the witches of sin? How did the witch cultists play into the story of the previous witches of sin? How did the witches of sin pass away? What were their abilities? And who are the sin archbishops? Well, today I want to answer all those questions and a whole lot more, because today we're talking ReZero's scariest antagonists explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. But before we get into all that, today we're going to talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, Fume. Fume is an industry leader in the flavored air category, and is quickly becoming one of the leading alternatives to smoking and vaping. It's kickstarting a whole new movement towards better habits. But how and why? Well, Fume is an award-winning flavored air device that draws flavor to your mouth. It helps fill the void that ditching a bad habit can leave, giving you something to reach for. But it's not a vape. There's no vapor, which means you can use it anywhere. And there's no nicotine, which means it's non-habit forming. All you gotta do is take one of these flavor cores, slip it into your Fume, put this wooden piece over it, and boom, you're ready to go with flavored air of tons of different flavors. Oh, that's good, maple pepper. And all of the flavors are non-toxic, so it's all guilt-free. On top of that, as Fume is powered by your breath, there's no batteries, so nothing to charge. On top of that, its metal and wood design looks awesome and gives it weight, so it's fun to fidget with. It's got magnets in it, which make it fun to slip up and down, and it's got this little salt pepper twister thing that allows you to control how much air comes in and out of it. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story they serve. For a limited time, use my code Weeb to get your free topper. It's the perfect accessory for your Fume. All you have to do is slip it on the mouthpiece for a softer, warmer feel. It's chewable for those who love to fidget, and it's reusable. And if you're lucky, you could win one of Fume's limited edition gold-plated devices this holiday season. Again, that's tryfume.com/Weeb, or just scan the QR code on screen to grab yours now and make someone's holiday unforgettable. So what do we say, folks? It's about time we start kicking those bad habits. So today I want to start this video off in the way that we tend to start these kinds of videos off, by answering the easy questions. So let's start with the easiest of questions. What is a witch? Well, unfortunately, that incredibly easy question doesn't necessarily have an easy answer. See, the easiest, simplest way to break down what a witch is in the ReZero universe is to say that a witch is somebody who possesses a witch factor. And from that witch factor, that witch is able to use something known as an authority. Now, in the simplest possible explanation, all of these witch factors and authorities tie their roots back to some of the 7 deadly sins and the 2 archaic sins. The 7 deadly sins being, and I'm gonna have to read these, I don't have them memorized, I stopped going to church at 3, envy, greed, wrath, sloth, gluttony, pride, and lust. But there's also 2 archaic sins that supposedly predate the 7 deadly sins, and those 2 sins are vainglory glory, and melancholy. But before we get too deep into the idea of sins, let's retouch on what a witch factor is. Witch factors are said to be the exact opposite of the Odd Longna, which is a mana reserve in the center of the ReZero world that is thought to be the heart of all creation. And for the purposes of today's video, that's kind of all you need to know. It's the well of mana that keeps the ReZero world alive, much like the sun does for our world. And thus these witch factors are supposed to be an opposing life force to the Odd Longna. And therefore the authorities granted from these witch factors are said to be the exact opposite of the divine protections granted by the Odd Longna. And divine protections are basically like the power system of the ReZero world. They're abilities given to people at birth by the Odd Longna. But even though authorities are said to be a foil of divine protections, authorities are usually stronger than divine protections, as it's stated that no divine protection can overpower an authority, and that somebody's divine protection can actually be removed by somebody with an authority. On top of this, those with witch factors are able to pass out their authorities to others, like how Petalgeist, one of the Sin archbishops, was able to share his witch factor with apostles that he named his hands. I'm sorry, his fingers. Wrong body part. And that's kind of the state of the ReZero world right now. See, because the only reason that the Witches of Sin were ever referred to as the Witches of Sin in the first place is because they were compatible with witch factors. And therefore it's stated that the Witches of Sin that we knew from roughly 400 years ago in the ReZero world are no different from the witches who came before them, and are therefore implied to be really no different from the Sin archbishops of the witch cultists who currently hold on to all of the witches factors right now. All this is to say, all you need to be a witch is to be compatible with a witch factor. Yet, when we talk about witches, certain faces and certain names come to mind in the ReZero world. Most acutely, the names and faces that come to mind are the previous 7 Witches of Sin. So these 7 witches who were compatible with witch factors were active about 400 years ago. That is to say, about 400 years prior to the events of the ReZero timeline. However, as time progressed, 6 out of 7 of these witches died, leaving only the Witch of Envy standing. And after 6 members of essentially her family died, the Witch of Envy, Satella decided to go on a murderous frenzy that ended up in the destruction of half of the planet. Now, this event is known in a somewhat Fire Force-ian way as the Great Calamity. Now, in this rampage, Satella flattened, salted, and burned half the Earth, cementing Satella's name as the ultimate evil on Earth for the rest of time. However, before Satella could destroy the entirety of the Earth, a group of heroes banded together to defeat her. Those heroes were Flugel, the Sage, First Sword Saint Reed Estrella, and the Divine Dragon Volcanica. However, even with their combined powers, they weren't strong enough to defeat Satella, so they sealed her in the evil Sealing Stone Shrine. However, because Satella is virtually immortal, she would remain sealed in this evil Sealing Stone Shrine forever posing a threat against the world. And because Satella was a demi-human, being half-elf, a prejudice against demi-humans would be established for the rest of time because of her actions. Most specifically, against half-elves, like Amelia. But those are just the 7 Witches of Sin. Prior to their existence, many other witches existed, but previous generations didn't necessarily know what the path was in order to become a witch, and therefore oftentimes incredibly gruesome rituals were underwent to try to turn somebody into a witch, as more archaic civilizations simply didn't know that it was just compatibility with the witch factor that was required to make a witch. Thus they believed that anybody could become a witch, which is anything but true. However, fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, nowadays in modern day ReZero, we know exactly how to make a witch. And like I've already said, it boils down to compatibility, and thus all of the Sin archbishops of the witch cultists have a witch factor, or multiple. But does that mean now that the witch cult is in charge that things are better? No. In fact, they're much worse. The Sin archbishops of the witch cultists are almost exclusively wildly evil, while the original 7 Witches of Sin vary from incredibly evil to incredibly nice, with the majority of them landing in a moral grayish area. But the best way to establish differences in ideology between the 7 Witches of Sin and the witch cultists is the idea that the witch cultists' entire religion revolves around the Witch of Envy, Satella, the woman who wiped out half the Earth, and therefore the witch cult basically ignores the existence of the other 6 Witches of Sin, and therefore anybody who owns a witch artifact or talks about the other 6 Witches of Sin is judged painfully and usually fatally. One of the best examples of the witch cultists not standing for witch paraphernalia being traded, sold, or even talked about is the Garklaw incident, which happened about 15 years prior to Natsuki Subaru popping into the ReZero world. See, a rumor was spreading around that a witch artifact was being sold in the city square of the city of Gorkla, a notoriously well-fortified and garrisoned city in the Volscian Empire. I mean, it was so well garrisoned that a Volscian war god by the name of Kurgan was there, who was considered the greatest warrior in Volscian history. And yet all it took was the Sin Archbishop of Greed, Regulus Corneus, to destroy the entire city in pursuit of the witch artifact that was supposedly being sold there. And the craziest thing is, we don't know if the rumor was true or not. So far as we know, because a rumor was passed around that a witch artifact was being sold, an entire city was wiped out. That's the difference between the witch cultists and the witches of sin. But we haven't even really talked about the witches of sin yet, so let's get into them. So like we've already established, roughly 400 years ago, the last 7 witches of sin roamed the earth. They were the witch of envy, Satella, the witch of greed, Echidna, the witch of wrath, Minerva, the witch of sloth, Sekhmet, the witch of gluttony, Daphne, the witch of pride, Typhon, and the witch of lust, Carmilla. Now, well, if we're being honest, I know I established that the 7 witches of sin were better than the sin archbishops. That doesn't mean that they were all super dope to be around. In fact, all of the 7 witches of sin were considered calamities during their time, due in part either directly to their actions or just the things that happened when they were around. For example, Typhon used to travel from city to city, just murdering anybody who thought themselves to be a sinner. And we know she has a propensity for doing things like this because she does it to Subaru the second she meets him. She tears off his arm, revels at the fact that he didn't feel it, and then proceeds to dice him. Carmilla, the witch of lust, never necessarily tried to kill anybody, but because of her authority, the authority of lust, she has an ability known as Faceless Bride, an ability that captivates anybody who looks at her to the point where they forget to breathe because they're so entranced by her presence. They are so taken aback by her beauty and how entranced they are by her that their heart just simply stops. And thus Carmilla accidentally has killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. And Minerva, who's technically the nicest and best intentioned out of all of the 7 witches of sin, would cause a natural disaster anytime she used her authority, because she, as the witch of wrath, has the authority of wrath, a technique that allows her to affect the idea of cause and effect. See, Minerva has the ability to drain mana from Adlogna itself, and because she's able to drain mana directly from the source of life itself, she can rewrite the effect of cause and effect, allowing her to heal anybody regardless of how badly they've been injured. But because she's draining mana away from the source blood of the entire world, it strips mana from certain areas, which causes natural disasters. And unfortunately, Minerva has no control over who she heals and who she doesn't. Minerva has no ability to turn off her healing capabilities, meaning that anybody that she comes into contact with in an offensive way is actually just going to end up healing them. And so much so that if Minerva were to step on a bug, rather than killing the bug, she would heal it. But this doesn't necessarily mean that all of the 7 witches of sin were out there murdering humans, either intentionally or non-intentionally. Sekhmet, the witch of sloth, spent her entire life laying around, as you would expect from the witch of sloth, and Echidna, the witch of greed, just spent her entire life kind of like Orochimaru minus the human experimentation, trying to collect as much information about the world as possible. Still, at the end of the day, all of the witches were referred to as calamities because anywhere they were, people usually died. And because this getting rid of the witches was kind of humanity's #1 goal. And thus, like we've already established, 6 out of 7 of the witches were either killed off or simply just died from natural causes. Though, natural causes that humanity kind of pushed them into. See, every single one of the witches that died met their end in the nation of Lugunica, I believe is how you say it. Typhon, the witch of pride, was tricked into going to the city of Prestella, where she was caught and eventually drowned in a trap built for her. Now, Prestella is one of the 5 great cities of the Dragon Kingdom of Lugunica, and is known as the City of Water, so it's pretty apt that Typhon was drowned there. Sekhmet, who was the 2nd strongest of the witches of sin, only 2nd to the witch of envy, Satella, ended up fighting the great dragons of the kingdom of Lugunica, and she drove them far away from their homelands so that she could rest under the great waterfall, as she was the witch of sloth, and therefore everything that she did was tied into trying to rest for longer amounts of time. However, one day, for a reason we're not entirely sure of, Sekhmet decided to enter into combat against the great dragon, Volcanica, the dragon that was involved in the sealing of Satella and now protects the shrine in which Satella is sealed in. And over the course of this battle, Sloth fell into the great waterfall that she was resting around and died. Ironically, dying much like Typhon in a drowning-related instance, which is ironic because Typhon referred to Sekhmet as her mother. Daphne, the witch of gluttony, ended up starving in an unnamed desert. Minerva was lured into a trap by a group of elves and then was eventually driven mad by the amount of damage to the earth Satella was doing, which led to her death. Carmilla burned to death, and Echidna's death is actually something a lot of people don't know about. See, what the anime tells us about Echidna, undoubtedly the witch of sin we spend the most time with, is that after the death of all of her sisters, she went around and collected their souls, eventually taking them to the sanctuary where Natsuki Subaru eventually meets her. But in the web novel version of the story, it was actually at Volcanika's instruction that Echidna and the rest of the deceased witch's souls were bound to the sanctuary. And in the light novel, Echidna says that Volcanika destroyed her body and sealed her in the sanctuary. So the anime, web novel, and light novel tellings of Echidna coming to the sanctuary are all different, so you choose which one you like most. But even though Echidna was able to gather up all their souls and bind their souls to the sanctuary so that they as calamities would never impose any threats on humanity for the rest of time, that doesn't mean that their lasting legacies haven't imposed threats on humanity for the rest of time. See, while every single one of the deceased witches of sin left their own legacy on the planet they inhabited in one way or another, 3 witches in particular left a pretty not so great legacy behind. Well, I mean, some of their legacies aren't that bad. We'll just get into it. Echidna's legacy, outside of collecting the remains of all of her dead sisters and binding them to the sanctuary, was the creation of multiple different meteors, or objects that allow people to use magic without opening a gate. Now, a gate in the ReZero world is an invisible portal-like apparatus that exists in every living being, and this gate allows for mana to pass from Adlagna to the person. However, through the usage of meteors, the gate isn't necessary. Now, while there are a ton of different gates, it's been established that 2 fairly important gates were created by Echidna and now exist as her legacy. The first, and probably more important of the 2, was the conversation mirror, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's the ReZero form of FaceTime. Second creation that Echidna left behind was her meteor staff, a spear-like staff that could fire mana-concentrated lasers that would decimate anything in its path. That was apparently created to simply pester Volcanika. And when you consider the fact that this meteor staff is able to decimate entire towns with one fell swoop of a laser, the fact that it only pesters Volcanika should tell you how powerful that goddamn dragon is. So like Echidna left tools behind. It's not her fault if they get misused. Can't say the same for Daphne though, because what Daphne left behind was the witch beasts, also known as the white whale, the great rabbit, and the black serpent. All 3 of which were created by Daphne, the witch of gluttony, to satiate her insatiable hunger. But when she eventually figured out how to break out of the castle in which she was trapped in, so did the witch beasts that she created. But let's get deeper into that. Why did Daphne create these witch beasts? Well, Daphne created the white whale because it's huge, and therefore the sheer amount of meat that can be harvested from it is enough to satiate her hunger, if only for a little while. However, unfortunately, because Daphne wanted the fight between herself and her witch beast to be fair, she made the white whale way too powerful. However, unlike with the great rabbit and the black serpent, the white whale can be controlled by the authority of gluttony, which is why the witch cult would often use the white whale to cover up their crimes. And considering the fact that the white whale was able to erase anybody from the memories of all humanity that it consumed, or poison people with mana poisoning if they stayed in its midst for too long, it was like a super good pet to have to cover up crimes. Daphne created the great rabbit under the same pretenses that she made the white whale under. See, because the great rabbit has the ability to split off of itself indefinitely. That is to say that the great rabbit can reproduce infinitely, and therefore the only way to destroy the great rabbit is to destroy every single great rabbit simultaneously. And she's not wrong, except for the fact that the great rabbits have the ability to bite off entire arms with one bite, and their singular purpose on Earth is to consume everything, and therefore they're not necessarily a being you want multiplying indefinitely. Now, the black serpent is a bit weirder, because while yes, it's manifested as one or multiple serpents in the past, nothing about the way that the black serpent operates makes it seem as though it would be good food. See, the black serpent is capable of producing an incredibly potent poison from its body, a poison that manifests as a gigantic onslaught of black sludge, and anything this poison touches, it destroys, from people to trees to the ground itself. And if you come into contact with the sludge or the black serpent itself, you get 100 diseases and die. Not entirely sure what Daphne was going for here, but she released it onto the world. When it comes down to it, outside of Satella, Daphne's legacy is undoubtedly the worst, and it is certainly much worse than Typhon's legacy. Typhon's legacy is just that she has a cult-like following in the modern day, from a criminal organization known as the Scales, which operate in each of Luganika's main 5 cities. But with that, that's basically everything you need to know about witches on a grand scale. While we could go back and talk about every single one of the witches that we know, what their histories were, their abilities, how they died, I'd like to do that in the capacity of a ranked and explained video. So if you guys enjoyed me diving into ReZero here a little bit, let me know in the comments if you'd like additional content from this IP, because God knows there is so much to talk about in this universe. We could do an entire thing on the Great Calamity, we could talk about the witches individually, we could talk about the gods of the universe, we could talk about Adlagna. There is literally almost an infinite amount of things that we can talk about in this wildly packed universe. So if you want more ReZero content, tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I gotta go feed that puppy you just saw.